Hello there, my dreamy twilight travelers. Tonight, we descend into the darkest story the vampire world has ever known. A story older than Volterra, older than the Volturi's marble halls and careful laws, older than almost anything that still walks this earth. We travel to the Carpathian Mountains, to cold stone fortresses and ancient thrones, to the first empire that ever ruled our kind. I'm pouring my heart into these videos, and sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it. And then one of you leaves the sweetest comment, and it reminds me why I'm doing this. I haven't hit my goal of 1,000 subs yet, but I'm not giving up. If you want to support a small creator who's trying to make something beautiful, please consider subscribing. So, close your eyes. Breathe in the cold Carpathian air, and let the oldest story begin. Before Volterra, before his marble halls and his careful laws and his theatre of benevolent governance, before any of that existed, before any vampire alive today had drawn their first transformed breath, there was something older. Something that ruled not through persuasion or ideology or the patient accumulation of allies, but through the oldest and most honest form of authority the world has ever known. Pure, unadorned power. The willingness to destroy anything that would not kneel. This is where the story of Vladimir and Stefan begins, not in a moment of drama or revelation, but in the slow, deliberate construction of something that had never existed before. The first vampire empire, the original order, the world before the world that currently exists, buried so completely beneath centuries of Volturi rewriting that most vampires alive today have never heard its name spoken without contempt. They came from the land of dark forests and mountain stone, from the region that humans would eventually call Romania, from the ancient Carpathian world that existed long before any map gave it boundaries or any language gave it a single name. The precise date of their transformation is lost even to them, submerged beneath the accumulated weight of so many centuries that the human lives they once lived have become less than shadows. They know they are old. They know they were among the first. Beyond that, the specifics have long since ceased to matter. What matters is what they built. Vladimir came first, or Stefan did, or perhaps they came to their transformations within years of each other. This too has blurred beneath the centuries, and neither of them has ever found the question particularly interesting. What is interesting, what has always been interesting, is what happened after. The realization, arriving gradually across the early decades of their immortal existence, that the world they had awoken into had no organizing principle, no authority, no structure that told one vampire where another vampire's territory ended. Covens formed and dissolved. conflicts erupted over feeding grounds and settled human populations. The ancient world was alive with the chaos of a predator class that had not yet been organized. Vladimir and Stefan looked at this chaos and saw something different than their contemporaries saw. They did not see inconvenience or danger. They saw opportunity. The construction of their empire was not a sudden thing. It did not announce itself. It began with the Carpathian region, the mountainous terrain they knew best, the dense forests and elevated fortresses that offered natural advantages to beings who needed no light and felt no cold. They established themselves in the physical landscape first, claiming territory not through declaration, but through the simple reality of being the most dangerous things in it. Other vampires in the region learned quickly. Those who challenged the lesson were destroyed. Those who absorbed it became the outermost layer of what was, slowly and then with gathering momentum, becoming something without precedent, a court, a hierarchy, an empire. At its height, the Romanian Coven was not two vampires. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what Vladimir and Stefan built, and the most important thing that history, the Volturi's version of history, has worked hardest to obscure. They were a ruling pair at the apex of a structured system that extended across much of the ancient world. Beneath them existed a court of vampire subjects, each occupying a specific position in a hierarchy that was as clearly understood as any human feudal structure, and enforced with considerably more absolute consequences for transgression. Other covens across Europe and beyond existed in specific relationship to Romanian authority. Some were willing subjects, having concluded that fealty to the Romanians was preferable to the alternative. Some were conquered enemies who had learned the same lesson through considerably more painful means. Some were careful neutrals, maintaining enough distance and offering enough occasional tribute to exist beneath the radar of Romanian attention. But all of them, every coven in the known vampire world of that era, organized their existence around the gravitational fact of Romanian supremacy. The fortress in the Carpathians was the center of all of it. Ancient stone built into the mountain itself, cold in the way that only things built without any concession to human comfort can be cold. Its halls lit by torchlight that cast the kind of shadows appropriate to what moved through them. Other vampires came here to pay tribute, to seek audience, to demonstrate loyalty with a particular physical prostration that Vladimir and Stefan had long since decided was the appropriate expression of the relationship between the apex of power and everything beneath it. They were not cruel rulers in the way that cruelty requires effort or imagination. They were simply absolute. What they said was law, not because they had codified a legal system or invented an ideology to justify it, but because they were strong enough to destroy anything that suggested otherwise, and they had demonstrated this willingness consistently enough that the demonstration rarely needed repeating. This was governance in its most primitive and in some ways most honest form. There was no gap between what the Romanians claimed to be and what they actually were. They claimed to be the supreme power in the vampire world. They were the supreme power in the vampire world. The alignment was perfect. The human populations beneath them were a different kind of subject. The villages and settlements and eventually the towns that grew up in the shadow of Romanian territory existed in a relationship of superstitious terror, that the Romanians cultivated without ever needing to be explicit about. Humans sensed what they could not name. The old stories of their region, the folklore that would persist through the centuries, long after the specific knowledge was lost, were not imagination. They were memory, garbled, misattributed, shaped by the distortions of oral tradition and human reluctance to confront certain things directly, but memory nonetheless. Something lived in those mountains. Something fed on them and managed them with the casual indifference of beings for whom human populations were resources to be maintained rather than people to be considered. Vladimir and Stefan had no philosophers in their court, no vampires tasked with developing a justifying narrative for their rule. They would have found such a thing bewildering, perhaps even amusing. The world had a hierarchy. They were at the top of it. This required no further explanation. What they did not have, and this omission will become eventually the thread that everything unravels from, was a guard. Not in the way that matters. They had subjects and subordinates and vampires who would fight for them out of loyalty enforced through consequence. But they had no specifically assembled force of gifted vampires, no systematic collection of supernatural abilities organized for the purpose of maintaining their power. The thought would have seemed almost absurd to them. Their power was their own, their strength and their centuries and the absolute clarity of their dominance. Why would the apex of the natural order need to supplement itself? This was not arrogance in the way that word implies blindness. It was rather the specific cognitive limitation of beings who had sat unchallenged for so long that the concept of challenge had ceased to be fully real to them. They assessed the world accurately as it currently was. What they failed to assess was how completely a different kind of mind, operating from a different set of assumptions, might be remaking the possibilities of what the world could become. They were not watching Italy. They had no reason to watch Italy. Nothing significant had ever come from Italy, as far as they knew, and there was no indication that this was about to change. The empire they built was real. It was vast and old and organized and genuinely powerful in every way that power had ever been measured in the vampire world. The court in the Carpathian fortress hummed with the particular energy of a place at the center of things, of a hierarchy that understood its own position and performed it without self-consciousness. Vampires moved through those stone halls carrying the specific posture of beings who knew exactly where they stood in relation to everything else, and who found that knowledge comfortable. Vladimir and Stefan moved through it all with the ease of beings for whom authority had become as natural as breathing once was. They had ruled for so long that ruling was not something they did. It was something they were. Their identities had grown around their power the way ancient trees grow around stone, incorporating it so completely that separation had become structural impossibility. This was their world. It had been their world for longer than almost any other living thing could comprehend. It felt as permanent as the mountains that held their fortress, as inevitable as the darkness that fell every night across the forests of their territory. They were wrong, of course, but they did not know that yet. And in the long, cold autumn of their supremacy, with the court assembled beneath them and the old world organized around their gravity, there was no particular reason they should have. The storm was already forming in a city far to the south, in a mind utterly unlike their own. But the sky above the Carpathians was clear, and Vladimir and Stefan, who had never needed to look over their shoulders, were not looking south. Not yet. In the hills of Tuscany, in a walled city that humans had been building and rebuilding for centuries, something was beginning. Not with the announcement of an empire or the declaration of a challenge. Not with anything the Romanians would have recognized as the opening movement of a threat. It began quietly, in the way that the most dangerous things tend to begin, with a single mind of extraordinary capability starting to ask a question that no one in the vampire world had previously thought to ask. The question was simple, almost elegant in its simplicity. Not how do I become powerful, but rather, what would make power permanent? The mind asking this question belonged to Aro. He was ancient even then, though not ancient in the way Vladimir and Stefan were ancient. Not with the geological depth of beings whose origins dissolved into prehistory. Aro knew when he had been transformed. He knew who had transformed him and why and under what circumstances. His origins were not lost to him. He was simply very, very old, and he'd been thinking very, very carefully for a very long time about the specific problem of how power was constructed and maintained, and crucially, why it so often failed. He had watched empires, human ones mostly, in those early centuries, the great organizing projects of the ancient Mediterranean world, the civilizations that rose with such confidence and collapsed with such apparent surprise. He had watched them from the margins as the vampires of that era tended to exist, predatory and peripheral and paying close attention. And what he had observed over centuries of this careful watching was a consistent pattern. Empires built on force alone were stable only as long as the force was demonstrably superior to any available alternative. The moment that superiority was genuinely challenged, not threatened, not questioned, but actually tested and found to have limits, the entire structure was revealed as contingent, as temporary, as a performance of permanence rather than permanence itself. The Romanians had the oldest and most thoroughly demonstrated force in the vampire world. Aro understood this with complete clarity. He had no illusions about the current balance of power and no interest in challenging it prematurely, which is perhaps the most important thing that can be said about the difference between his mind and the minds of the various vampires who had, over the centuries, attempted to resist Romanian dominance through direct confrontation and been destroyed for the effort. Aro was not going to challenge Romanian power directly. He was going to make it irrelevant. The first thing he understood was that supernatural gifts were not equally distributed and not equally significant. Some vampires developed abilities after transformation that were essentially personal advantages, enhanced senses, physical gifts, minor improvements on baseline vampire capabilities. These were useful but not strategically transformative. But others developed abilities that were categorically different. Abilities that could alter the outcome of conflicts regardless of the physical strength of the vampires involved. Abilities that, if assembled and organized correctly, could constitute a force of a completely different kind than anything that currently existed. His own gift was the foundation of everything. Aro could read every thought a person had ever had through a single touch. Not the surface impressions of a mind in the present moment, as Edward Cullen would later develop, but the complete archive of a consciousness, every memory, every intention, every secret that had ever passed through someone's awareness. This made him the most comprehensively informed being in any room he entered. He knew, within moments of physical contact, everything about a person that it was possible to know. Their fears and desires and loyalties, their breaking points, their hidden resentments and their genuine devotions, their capabilities and their limitations. In a world where almost all significant decisions were based on incomplete information, Arrow operated with something approaching complete information. The advantage this provided was almost impossible to overstate. Marcus saw differently. His gift perceived the bonds between people, the threads of relationship that connected one being to another, their nature and their strength and their vulnerabilities, love and loyalty and obligation and resentment and fear, all of the invisible architecture that determined how groups of beings actually functioned, were visible to Marcus as clearly as physical objects were visible to ordinary eyes. He could look at any gathering of vampires and understand immediately who was genuinely loyal to whom, who harbored hidden grievances, who was bound by fear rather than devotion, which relationships were load-bearing and which were decorative. Combined with Arrow's comprehensive knowledge of individual minds, this created a political intelligence of extraordinary sophistication. They could walk into any situation and understand it completely before anyone in that situation had finished deciding how to present themselves. Caius brought something different and in some ways equally valuable. He had no supernatural gift, a fact that made him in certain superficial assessments seem the least remarkable of the three. But Caius possessed a quality that gifts could not reliably supply: a ruthless, unsentimental clarity about threat and consequence. He was the one who looked at every situation and asked, without flinching, what the worst possible outcome was and what would need to happen to prevent it. He was constitutionally incapable of the kind of optimistic reasoning that led other powerful beings to underestimate dangers they found inconvenient to fully acknowledge. He balanced Arrow's visionary intelligence and Marcus's relational perception with something that kept both grounded in the specific cold reality of what was actually at stake. Together, they formed something that was, in its own way, as unprecedented as the Romanian Empire had been in its time. A ruling intelligence of three genuinely complementary minds, each compensating for the other's limitations, each amplifying the other's strengths. And from the beginning, they agreed on the strategy that would define everything that followed. They would build a guard, not subjects, not a court of vampires who owed fealty through conquest, but a specifically assembled force of gifted individuals chosen for the strategic value of their abilities. Each addition to the guard would be evaluated not for strength alone, but for what they could contribute to a collective capability that was designed from its inception with a specific purpose in mind. Chelsea was among the most important of the early acquisitions, though her gift worked invisibly and her name would never carry the fearsome resonance of some who came after. She could manipulate the emotional bonds between vampires, strengthen loyalty until it approached compulsion, dissolve devotion until it simply ceased to exist, redirect the attachment that a vampire felt for one person toward another. In a world where vampire relationships were among the most permanent and deeply felt bonds in existence, the ability to quietly reshape them was a weapon of almost unimaginable strategic value. With Chelsea, the Volturi could do something the Romanians had never imagined necessary. They could undermine the loyalty structures of other covens without those covens knowing it was happening. They could turn allies into neutrals, subjects into individuals whose connection to their rulers had inexplicably cooled, enemies into beings who could no longer quite remember why they had considered themselves enemies. The preparation for any conflict could be conducted entirely through Chelsea's gift, invisibly and without provocation, leaving a target isolated and bewildered before a single overt move was made. Dmitri came later, and his gift completed a different dimension of the Volturi's capability. Once he had a clear sense of a mind, its particular texture and quality, he could track it across any distance, through any concealment, regardless of how far or how cleverly the person moved. The practical meaning of this gift was simple and devastating. Once the Volturi had decided someone needed to be found, that person could not hide. The certainty of eventual capture made resistance not merely difficult, but existentially futile. What was the point of running from something that would find you regardless of where you went? These two gifts, Chelsea's invisible restructuring of loyalty and Dimitri's inescapable tracking, meant that the Volturi's power operated on a level that physical strength alone could never achieve. They could dissolve opposition before it organized and retrieved anyone who attempted to escape after the fact. The architecture of control was comprehensive in a way that the Romanian model of raw domination simply could not replicate. And then there were the twins. Jane and Alec did not come to the Volturi as vampires. They came as human children, extraordinarily gifted human children, living in a village that Aro had become aware of through his network of careful observation. The precise circumstances of how they came to his attention are difficult to reconstruct, but the nature of Aro's attention, once fixed on something valuable, was total and patient. He waited. He observed. He allowed time to pass and circumstances to develop, and when the moment was appropriate, when the alternative to his intervention would have been the destruction of two minds of extraordinary potential, he acted. Jane's gift, once she was transformed, was the ability to create the illusion of pain so overwhelming and absolute that it incapacitated its target completely regardless of their physical strength or combat experience. It did not matter how powerful a vampire was, how old, how experienced, how many centuries of conflict they had survived. Jane could, with a look, reduce them to a paralyzed, shrieking non-functionality from which there was no defense and no recovery, except her choice to stop. Alec's gift was quieter, and in some ways more terrifying. He could sever a vampire's connection to all sensation, sight, sound, smell, touch, cutting them off from their senses so completely that they stood helpless in an absolute void, unable to perceive anything around them, unable to respond to threats they could no longer detect, simply standing and waiting in perfect blankness for whatever was about to happen to them. Together, the twins made the Volturi's guard not merely formidable, but essentially insurmountable in direct confrontation. Any force that moved against them would first be stripped of its bonds by Chelsea, then tracked down by Dmitri if it fled, and then faced with the combined abilities of Jane and Alec in any direct engagement. There was no conventional military answer to this combination. It required either an equally extraordinary collection of countering gifts, or something the Volturi had made certain no other coven possessed. An organized, specifically assembled, strategically coherent force. Alongside all of this, Aro was doing something the Romanians had never considered worth doing. He was constructing a narrative. The Volturi were not presenting themselves as conquerors. They were presenting themselves as a necessity. The vampire world had a problem: the growing risk of exposure to the human populations that surrounded them, the chaos of ungoverned vampire behavior that threatened to draw attention that would be dangerous for every vampire alive. The Volturi were offering a solution: laws enforcement, a structure that protected the secrecy of vampire existence by providing consequences for those who violated it. The laws were genuine. The problem they addressed was real. The benefit to the broader vampire world was not entirely fictional, but the laws also conveniently and systematically prohibited exactly the kinds of independent power that could challenge Volturi supremacy. No coven could grow beyond a certain size. No individual vampire could claim territory so extensive it drew human scrutiny. No immortal children, beings of extraordinary power and zero controllability, could be created. These laws protected the Volturi's secret, yes. They also protected the Volturi's position. Most vampires accepted this framing because the alternative, acknowledging that they were being governed by a power that had structured its authority specifically to perpetuate itself, was uncomfortable and, more practically, dangerous to voice. The Volturi were very thorough about the consequences of vocal dissent. In the Carpathian fortress, none of this registered as significant. The Romanians were aware of Aro. They were aware of Volterra. They noted, with the mild interest of being secure in their own supremacy, that a coven in Italy seemed to be accumulating some influence. They did not investigate further. They did not send anyone south to assess what was being built. They had never needed to watch their periphery carefully before. And the habit of watchfulness is difficult to develop when the habit of invulnerability has been accumulating for centuries. Aro, who knew everything about how Romanian power was structured and where its vulnerabilities lay, was watching with complete attention. The Romanians were not watching at all. The war did not begin with a declaration. There was no challenge issued from Volterra, no messenger sent north to the Carpathian fortress with terms or ultimatums or any of the formal architecture that human conflicts used to mark the beginnings. There was no morning on which Vladimir and Stefan woke to find the world had changed overnight. There was no clear line, no identifiable moment, no single event that could be pointed to as the threshold between before and after. That was the point. That was the strategy. The Romanians had spent centuries defending against threats that announced themselves. A rival coven moving into their territory. A subject who refused tribute and needed to be made an example. A challenge that came through action or declaration and could be met with the overwhelming force that Vladimir and Stefan had always been able to bring to bear. They were extraordinarily good at responding to visible threats. They had built their entire empire on the demonstrated capacity to do exactly that. Aro had understood this with the completeness that his gift afforded him. He had touched enough minds, gathered enough information over enough centuries to understand precisely how the Romanian system of power functioned and, more importantly, where its architecture was vulnerable. It was vulnerable everywhere that it relied on loyalty, and it relied on loyalty everywhere. What began instead of a declaration was a silence, a gradual, almost imperceptible cooling in the bonds that had held the Romanian court together for centuries. Vampires who had served Vladimir and Stefan for generations found their devotion inexplicably dimming, not vanishing overnight, not transforming suddenly into open resentment or visible dissent, simply becoming less certain, less warm. The absolute quality that genuine vampire loyalty possessed, that deep, unquestioning orientation toward another being that could persist unchanged across centuries, began to feel in certain vampires like something more conditional, more negotiable. The threads that had felt permanent began to feel in ways that were difficult to articulate and impossible to trace to any cause, like options rather than facts. Chelsea was working. She worked from a distance first, operating through the Volturi's existing network of contacts and informants, identifying the key relationships in the Romanian hierarchy and assessing which to weaken and in what sequence. The outer layers first, the tributary covens and allied groups whose connection to Romanian authority was already more instrumental than devotional, whose loyalty was maintained by calculation as much as feeling. These were the easiest threads to loosen, requiring only a subtle shift in the emotional valence of the relationship, a cooling of whatever warmth had made the connection feel worthwhile. A coven that had paid tribute to the Romanians for 2 centuries because it was the prudent arrangement found itself, gradually and without understanding why, feeling less certain that prudence required continued deference. The calculation that had always resolved in the Romanians' favor began, mysteriously, to seem more genuinely open. Some drifted toward neutrality. Some, whose bonds Chelsea reshaped more aggressively as the work progressed, drifted further than neutrality, developing a quiet but genuine coolness toward their former rulers that made them susceptible to Volturi overtures when those overtures eventually came. None of them understood what was happening. The shifts felt internal, personal, like genuine reassessments born from their own thinking, rather than alterations imposed from outside. This was the particular genius of Chelsea's gift. It left no evidence of itself, produced no sensation of violation, created changes that felt indistinguishable from natural evolution of feeling. Then she worked inward, into the court itself, into the relationships that constituted the actual structural core of Romanian power. This required more time and greater precision. The bonds between the inner court members and their rulers were older and deeper, and had been reinforced by centuries of shared existence and shared interest. But deep bonds were not immune to Chelsea's attention, only more demanding of it. She worked with patience that reflected both her nature and the long timeline Aro had established for this project. There was no urgency. The work would take as long as it took, and premature action was infinitely more dangerous than extended preparation. By the time the Volturi began moving toward the Carpathians with any visible intention, the Romanian Empire had already been hollowed, not visibly from the outside to any observer who was not specifically looking for what Chelsea had done. The court still appeared intact. Vampires still occupied their positions. The hierarchy still existed in its formal structure, but the substance of it, the loyalty and devotion and genuine willingness to fight and die for their rulers that had always been the real content of those structural forms, had been quietly removed from a significant portion of it. The Romanians were, without knowing it, commanding a court that was in many places a facade of itself. Vladimir and Stefan did not see it. They were looking outward, as they always had, watching for the kind of threat that the vampire world had always produced. They were not looking at the faces of their own court and asking why certain expressions seemed slightly less absolute than they remembered. They were not tracking the subtle cooling in rooms that had always been warm with loyalty. They had never needed to watch for this because nothing like it had ever existed before, and the habits of perception that centuries of unchallenged supremacy had built in them did not include the particular vigilance that Chelsea's gift required to detect. When the Volturi moved, they moved with a full guard, assembled. Jane and Alec travelled north together, the twins whose transformation had been the culmination of Aro's long gift collection strategy, whose abilities represented something categorically beyond anything the Romanian court had encountered or could have prepared for. Dimitri moved with them, his tracking gift ensuring that any Romanian court member who attempted to flee the coming conflict before it concluded could be found and dealt with. Chelsea continued working even in the approach, reaching further into the remaining loyal bonds of the inner court, ensuring that when the moment of confrontation arrived, the resistance it would meet was as diminished as it was possible to make it. The Carpathian fortress received them as it had received so many others across the centuries, with the cold silence of ancient stone, with the particular quality of darkness that belonged to a place built without any concession to human comfort. But the atmosphere within was different from anything it had held before. Not the controlled deference of tributary covens come to demonstrate loyalty, not the tense negotiation of a challenged rival seeking terms, something that the stones of that fortress had genuinely never held in all their centuries. The presence of something that could not be stopped. The Romanian court fought. Let that be stated clearly and without qualification, because it matters to the complete truth of what happened. They were not broken before the battle began, not so thoroughly dismantled by Chelsea's work that they offered no resistance. Those who remained genuinely loyal, and there were such vampires, even in the hollowed court, bonds that Chelsea had not reached or had not fully succeeded in loosening, fought with the full ferocity that centuries of existence and the defense of everything they had known could produce. They fought the way beings fight when they understand that what is at stake is not merely their lives but the entire world. They inhabit the entire framework of meaning within which their existence has been organized. But they were fighting a force that had been specifically engineered to make their fighting irrelevant. Jane moved through the fortress, and the conflict reorganized itself around her presence. A vampire who had endured 3 centuries of European territorial warfare, who had survived conflicts that had destroyed dozens of their contemporaries, who possessed physical strength and speed that represented the accumulated advantages of centuries of vampire existence. This vampire encountered Jane's attention and was reduced within seconds to a paralyzed, shrieking stillness from which nothing in their centuries of accumulated capability offered any escape. Physical strength meant nothing when the body would not obey. Speed meant nothing when every nerve was consumed by the illusion of unbearable pain. Experience meant nothing when there was no situation to read, no opponent to assess. Only the overwhelming reality of agony that Jane chose to create and chose to maintain until she chose to stop. She moved through the Romanian defenders with a terrible patience. her gift requiring no physical contact and no prolonged engagement. Simply her attention settling on one target and then the next. The ancient stone halls of the fortress became a place where centuries of accumulated vampire power were extinguished one by one with a methodical efficiency that had nothing to do with combat, as the Romanians had ever understood it. Alec worked differently, and in certain ways more devastatingly when the scale of the conflict required it. Where Jane worked on individuals with concentrated precision, Alec could extend his gift outward like a spreading fog, rolling through a space and touching every mind it reached, severing each one from all sensations simultaneously. Sight, sound, smell, touch, all of it simply ceased. Vampires who had been fighting, assessing, responding, making the rapid and experienced decisions that centuries of conflict had trained them for, found themselves suddenly standing in absolute nothing. No perception of the space around them, no awareness of threat or movement or anything external at all. Only the void, complete and total, and within it the helpless knowledge that something was happening around them in a world they could no longer perceive. They stood and waited in that blankness for an ending that came without warning, without the possibility of last resistance, without any of the dignity that a genuine fight might have preserved. The fortress fell, not in the way that a prolonged siege produces incremental, negotiated surrender, not in the way that an evenly matched conflict exhausts itself toward a conclusion, but with the particular speed and completeness of a structure whose foundations have been removed before the first visible crack appears. The court that had constituted the organizational reality of the vampire world, the hierarchy that had persisted for longer than most living things could comprehend, was destroyed in hours, not scattered or defeated in a way that implied eventual reconstitution. Destroyed. The inner court, the vampires whose loyalty had been genuine and whose devotion had persisted through Chelsea's work, who had stood and fought in the stone halls of a fortress that had been the center of the world they knew. They were gone. Vladimir and Stefan were present for enough of it to understand with complete clarity what was happening and what the outcome would inevitably be. They were ancient and they were intelligent, and they had spent centuries accurately assessing situations that other vampires found too chaotic or too frightening to read clearly. They read this one with the same clarity, and what they read told them that continuing to fight was not bravery. It was waste. It was throwing the only remaining pieces of what had survived against a force that would absorb those pieces without being meaningfully diminished by them. They ran into the forest they had known longer than almost any other living thing, through the ancient mountain terrain of the Carpathians that was as familiar to them as familiarity itself, moving with the full speed of vampires whose age had refined every physical capability to its absolute limit. Whether the Volturi chose not to press the pursuit to its conclusion, finding it sufficient to have achieved their primary objective and content to leave two survivors as witnesses to the lesson they had delivered, or whether Vladimir and Stefan simply moved through that landscape too quickly and too knowledgeably for even Dimitri's gift to produce a certain outcome. This question has no definitive answer. Perhaps both things contain part of the truth. Perhaps Aro, whose understanding of narrative was as sophisticated as his understanding of power, found something useful in the existence of two ancient vampires who would carry the story of what had happened into the future he was now building. The vampire world reorganized itself around the new reality with a speed that reflected how comprehensively Aro had prepared the ground. Covens that had oriented their existence around Romanian authority found that orientation simply gone. The gravitational center they had always navigated toward replaced overnight by something new. Volturi, the walled Tuscan city. Aro, who received the news of each coven's reorientation with a particular satisfaction of someone watching a very long plan, reached the stage where its results become visible. The Carpathian fortress went silent. Its ancient stone halls, which had held the courts and tributes and elaborate performances of loyalty of a vampire world organized around Romanian supremacy, were emptied of everything that had given them meaning. The torchlight that had burned in those corridors since before living memory went out, and the darkness that replaced it was a different kind of darkness than the fortress had ever known before. Not the inhabited darkness of a place at the center of things, the abandoned darkness of a monument to impermanence. Vladimir and Stefan moved through forests that were no longer their forests, through a world that was no longer their world, and behind them the ruins of everything they had constructed settled into the cold Carpathian ground with the finality of things that have ended completely. They had each other. They had the full and perfect memory of what had existed and what had been taken. And moving through them in those first hours and days of the new world's beginning was something that had not previously existed in its current form. Something that the destruction of the fortress had crystallized from the raw material of shock and grief and fury into a substance of an entirely different quality. Harder than any of those things. Colder, more permanent, more patient. The hatred that would define the next several thousand years had found the shape it would keep forever. They did not stop moving for a long time after the fortress fell. Not because they were being pursued with any immediate urgency. Not because the Volturi's forces were close enough behind them to require constant flight, but because stopping meant arriving somewhere, and arriving somewhere meant beginning the process of understanding what their existence now was, what it contained, what it was organized around, now that the thing it had been organized around for centuries had been taken from them in a single night of systematic destruction. Movement was simpler than that reckoning, so they moved. The first years after the fall exist in their history as something difficult to reconstruct with any precision, not because the events of those years were lost to memory, but because the quality of that period was so uniform, so unrelenting in its particular texture of hollowness and fury, that individual moments within it blur together into a single extended experience. They fed when they needed to feed, moving through human populations with the casual efficiency of beings for whom hunting had never required effort. They spoke to each other and did not speak, occupying the particular silence that exists between two beings who understand each other so completely that language becomes optional. They moved through the landscapes of their former territory and then beyond it, into regions they had always known peripherally as the outer edges of an empire whose center had been elsewhere. Now there was no center. There was only the moving through, the endless traversal of a world that had been reorganized around their absence while they were still present in it, still walking through it, still feeding on its human populations with the same indifferent ease as they always had, while everything that had given that walking and feeding a context had been stripped away. The human populations they passed through during those early decades knew something had changed, in the way that human populations always sense the movements and shifts of things they could not directly perceive or name. The old stories of the Carpathian region, the folklore that had always contained a compressed and distorted memory of what lived in the mountain fortresses and moved through the valley villages in the darkness, began shifting. New elements appeared in old stories, the language of displacement, of something ancient that had once been fixed and centered, now moving without anchor through familiar landscapes. Humans gave names to what they felt without understanding what they were naming, as they always had. And the names were not wrong exactly, only insufficient in the way that human language was always insufficient when it reached for something genuinely outside its capacity to hold. Vladimir and Stefan did not concern themselves with human perceptions. They rarely had. What they concerned themselves with in those first decades, and then in the centuries that slowly accumulated behind the decades like geological strata, was the specific problem of how to exist with what they were carrying. Because the hatred that had crystallized in the ruins of the Carpathian fortress did not diminish with time in the way that human grief was supposed to diminish. It did not soften at its edges or become more manageable through the simple accumulation of distance from its origin. It did not transform itself, as human psychology tended to eventually transform unbearable feeling into something duller and more livable. It simply persisted at exactly the intensity it had achieved in those first hours after the fall, with exactly the same clarity of object and exactly the same specificity of direction, day after day and decade after decade, and eventually century after century, as fresh and certain and perfectly targeted as it had been in the first moment of its formation. This was, in its own terrible way, one of the defining features of what it meant to be what they were. Human beings carried their losses differently. The architecture of human grief was designed, in some fundamental neurological sense, for eventual metabolization, for the slow transformation of acute pain into something more livable, for the process that humans called healing, and that depended entirely on the fact that human memory was imperfect and human feeling was subject to the erosion of time. Vladimir and Stefan had neither of these mercies available to them. Vampire memory was perfect and permanent. Every detail of what had existed and what had been taken was as vivid in their recollection as it had been the day it happened. The court in the Carpathian halls, the weight of centuries of uncontested authority, the specific texture of a world organized around their supremacy, all of it preserved in perfect, undiminishing clarity, available for comparison against the world as it now was at any moment they chose to make that comparison. And vampire feeling was as durable as the marble flesh that housed it. The specific emotional configuration that the fall of their empire had created was as immune to the passage of time as their bodies were immune to aging. They were going to feel this forever with complete and undiminished intensity, because forever was what they had, and nothing about the structure of what they were provided any mechanism for the feeling to go anywhere except deeper. The question was what to do with it. The obvious answer, direct confrontation with the Volturi, the attempted reclamation of their empire through force. was not available to them, and they understood this with a pragmatic clarity that sat in strange contrast to the depth of what they carried. They were two vampires. The Volturi had Chelsea and Dimitri, and Jane and Alec, and a guard that had been specifically engineered to make direct confrontation suicidal for any force without an equally extraordinary counter-capability. Vladimir and Stefan had looked directly at what the Volturi's assembled gifts could do to experienced and powerful vampires in a prepared defensive position, and they had made the rational assessment that two ancient vampires, however old and however capable, were not a sufficient answer to it. The mathematics were simply wrong. This assessment did not produce acceptance. It produced patience of a specific and focused kind, not the patience of beings who had let go of what they wanted and were learning to want something else. The patience of beings who knew exactly what they wanted and had determined that waiting was the only viable path toward it. These were different things, and the difference mattered enormously to understanding what Vladimir and Stefan became during the long centuries of their exile. They watched the Volturi consolidate. From the careful distance of beings who understood that drawing overt attention was dangerous, who operated within the technical boundaries of the new laws, while making absolutely no internal concession to their legitimacy, they observed everything. The laws themselves they treated with a contempt so thorough and so settled that it had long since ceased to feel like active resistance and had become simply the baseline condition of their existence. The compliance was physical and entirely hollow. They followed the rules the way a tide follows a shoreline, not because the shoreline has any authority over the tide, but because the geography of the current situation makes that the direction the water happens to move. The moment the geography changed, the compliance would end without a second's hesitation or regret. What they observed from their position at the margins was a comprehensive education in everything the Volturi were doing and how they were doing it. They watched Aro's gift collection strategy continue to develop and deepen across the centuries, watched the guard grow more formidable with each new acquisition, watched each carefully chosen addition extend the Volturi's reach and compound the structural difficulty of mounting any meaningful challenge to them. They watched the laws become entrenched across the vampire world, watched the initial disorientation that had followed the fall of the old order gradually transform in generation after generation of newly transformed vampires into the unexamined assumption that the current arrangement was simply how things were. Natural, inevitable, the way the vampire world had always functioned. This observation was among the most bitter of everything the centuries produced. Not the fall itself, not the specific violence of the fortress and the court and the destruction of what they had built. Those things were terrible with a clarity that at least had the integrity of being genuinely terrible. The bitterest thing was the fading, the gradual disappearance of the Romanian Empire from the active memory of the vampire world, not a violent erasure. The Volturi were too sophisticated for anything so obvious, too aware that aggressive historical revision could itself become a grievance. But a simple, natural fading, the inevitable consequence of time passing, and the old order becoming less and less relevant to the lived experience of vampires whose daily reality was organized entirely around the new one. Covens that had known the Romanian court firsthand died in conflicts or dispersed into smaller units, or were absorbed into the Volturi's expanding network of relationships. Each generation of newly transformed vampires had less personal memory of any authority other than Volterra, less context for understanding what the Romanian Empire had been, or why its loss represented anything worth mourning or resisting. Each passing century produced more of the vampire world's population, for whom the Romanians were, at most, a dim historical reference, a predecessor authority mentioned occasionally in the context of explaining why the Volturi's rise had been necessary, rather than a living reality that anyone felt personally. Vladimir and Stefan remained. Their memory remained perfect. The world they remembered with such complete and undiminishing clarity continued to exist in them with the same vividness it had possessed when it was still the actual world, while outside of them it became less and less real to anyone else. This was the specific and peculiar torment of their exile. Not just that the empire had been taken, but that they were slowly becoming the only place it still existed, the last complete witnesses to a world the Volturi's order had replaced and preferred unremembered. Their companionship during these centuries became something that had no adequate name in any language either of them had ever spoken. It was not friendship, though it contained the duration that friendship aspired to. It was not partnership in the conventional sense, though they had been partners in every enterprise for longer than most of the world could comprehend. It was something closer to the relationship between the two halves of a single thing that had been divided and could not be reconstituted, but had learned to function in its divided state. There was no one else in the world who understood what they carried. Not in the way that genuine understanding requires shared experience rather than reported information. Any vampire they encountered could be told about the Romanian Empire, could hear the history, could intellectually grasp the dimensions of the loss. But comprehension was not what telling produced. Only each other possessed the actual experience, the lived memory, the specific quality of having been there and having lost it, and having walked away and kept walking for centuries afterward. This made their bond immune to Chelsea in a way that the Volturi presumably understood and presumably found acceptable. Breaking it would have required dismantling the only thing holding two ancient and dangerous vampires in a state of contained, directed purpose, rather than releasing them into something less predictable. The dark humor that would be visible to the assembled witnesses in Forks thousands of years later emerged across these centuries as something genuinely necessary, not as performance, not as an affectation of eccentricity, but as a survival strategy for inhabiting an otherwise fully uninhabitable situation across an unlimited timescale. If the experience of being the dispossessed rulers of the original vampire empire, reduced to wandering the edges of a world built over the ruins of what they had constructed, was to be lived with across literal eternity, it had to become at least occasionally absurd. They found the absurdity, cultivated it even, the theatrical quality, the precise and perfectly timed observations about the specific indignities of their situation, the particular pleasure they took in finding exactly the right words for things other beings were too frightened or too polite to name. This was millennia of practice. This was what beings looked like who had decided that if they could not change their circumstances, they could at least describe them with devastating accuracy. They settled periodically in the Eastern European regions that had been their original territory, never rebuilding anything that could genuinely be called a permanent home, never gathering subjects or constructing the organizational scaffolding of something that might have resembled a court, whether this was the Volturi's laws making large independent structures dangerous, or the particular pride that would not permit them to construct a lesser version of what had been taken, or some combination of both that they themselves may not have fully distinguished between. The result was the same. They remained two. They always remained two. The last of something that had once been vast, reduced by war and time and the slow work of the world's indifference to its most irreducible unit. The Volturi monitored them from Volterra with the periodic attention of beings who had assessed the threat level and found it manageable. They violated no laws in any demonstrable way. They gathered no followers, built no alliances that rose to the level of organized opposition, made no overt moves against Volturi authority. The calculus that had led to their survival continued to resolve in the same direction. They were watched and left to exist at the margins, two ancient remnants of the world that Volterra had replaced, walking through centuries of someone else's order with the perfect memory of a different one preserved inside them, like an ember that would not go out regardless of how completely the fire around it had been extinguished, almost entirely forgotten, not completely, because Vladimir and Stefan had not forgotten anything, and they were not finished with any of it, and the patience that had been forced on them by the realities of their situation had, across the grinding accumulation of century upon century, been transformed from a constraint into a capability. The controlled, focused, absolutely purposeful waiting of beings who had determined that the right moment had not yet arrived, but who had become, through sheer duration of practice, perhaps the most patient things in the world. They would recognize the right moment when it finally came. They had been waiting long enough, and remembering clearly enough, and hating with enough precision and permanence to be completely certain of that. To encounter Vladimir and Stefan for the first time is to experience something that does not map cleanly onto any other category of vampire that exists in the world as it currently is. They are not the Volturi, with their marble halls and their careful performances of benevolent authority and their elaborate theatrical presentation of power as responsibility. They are not the Cullens with their domestic warmth and their moral complexity and their ongoing negotiation between what they are and what they have chosen to become. They are not nomads exactly, though they have spent centuries moving. They are not a coven in any conventional sense, though they have never separated. They are something older than any of those categories, something that precedes the frameworks through which the contemporary vampire world understands itself. And this quality, this fundamental anteriority, this sense of existing outside and before the current order, is visible in everything about them, from the way they look to the way they speak to the specific quality of attention they bring to every situation they enter. Begin with the physical, because the physical tells its own story with vampires in a way it does not quite manage with humans. Vladimir's appearance carries the visible weight of his age in a manner that distinguishes him from almost every other vampire in existence. His complexion, which would have been olive in his human life. The warm Mediterranean adjacent tones of a man born into the ancient Carpathian world, has faded across the millennia into something that human color vocabulary struggles to name precisely. Ash is the closest approximation, a greyish pallor that suggests not illness as it might in a human face, but rather the specific effect of extreme duration on pigmentation that was never designed to last this long. He looks as though he's been worn by time in the way that stone is worn by water, not damaged exactly, not diminished, but marked by the passage of something that has been passing for a very long time. Stefan carries the same quality, the same ashen quality of extreme age made visible, though the specific features that age has settled into differ from Vladimir's in the ways that any two distinct people differ when subjected to the same long process. They are recognizably of the same era, the same origin, the same fundamental category of ancient thing. But they are not identical, and the differences between them are as legible as the similarities. Their eyes are perhaps the most striking single physical detail and the most informative. Vampires who feed on human blood typically display a vivid crimson, a color of striking intensity that reflects both the recency of feeding and the particular metabolic reality of their dietary choices. But Vladimir and Stefan's eyes have faded. The crimson is still present. They have never been anything other than human blood drinkers and have never had any intention of changing this. But it has deepened and darkened across the centuries into something more opaque, less vivid, closer to a dried and ancient red than the bright arterial color of a recently fed vampire. This fading is a marker of extreme age that very few vampires alive today would recognize, because very few vampires alive today have ever encountered anything old enough to display it. They look like what they are. This is rarer than it sounds. Their voices carry the same quality of accumulated duration. They speak contemporary languages with complete fluency. They have had sufficient time to learn everything, but the cadence beneath the fluency belongs to something older. There is a formal precision to their speech that reflects the linguistic habits of eras when language was a more deliberate instrument than it has since become, when the choice of a specific word carried implications that casual contemporary usage has largely dissolved. They are not archaic in the sense of being difficult to understand. They are archaic in the sense of being entirely precise, of choosing each word with an intentionality that marks them as beings who learn to speak in a world where words had specific weight. And then there is the dark humor, which is perhaps the most distinctive and the most disorienting thing about them, once the initial impression of their age has settled. They are funny. This requires stating directly because it is so thoroughly at odds with every expectation that the context of their existence creates. They are ancient vampires dispossessed of a millennia-old empire, carrying a hatred of oceanic depth and geological permanence toward the beings who took it from them, wandering the margins of a world that has largely forgotten they ever mattered. Nothing about this situation suggests a natural source of comedy, and yet they find it. Consistently, precisely, with a timing that suggests the humor has been refined across centuries of practice into something approaching an art form. The comedy they produce is not warm. It does not invite others into a shared delight or create the kind of atmosphere that makes people feel welcome and at ease. It is the humor of beings who have decided that if the universe insists on being this specific variety of terrible, the least they can do is notice exactly how terrible it is and describe that quality with precision. They find the exact word for the specific indignity. They identified the precise absurdity in the situation that others experience as merely frightening or oppressive. They comment on the Volturi's self-presentation, on the elaborate theatrical machinery of an authority that requires this much performance to sustain itself, with the particular credibility of beings who once held equivalent power and never found it necessary to dress it in quite this much ideological costuming. This humor is on examination a form of intelligence. It requires the ability to hold two registers simultaneously, the genuine weight of a situation and the gap between that weight and how the situation is being officially characterized, and to name that gap with enough precision to make it visible. Vladimir and Stefan do this constantly and effortlessly, having had millennia to develop the skill. Their relationship with each other is the other thing that strikes any careful observer, and it strikes deeply because it is unlike any other relationship in the vampire world. The bond between them has been forming and deepening for longer than almost any other relationship in existence. They have been each other's primary and in many periods only genuine company across a span of time that makes the longest human dynasty look brief. They have shared the fall of an empire and the long cold centuries of its aftermath, and the specific experience of being the last complete witnesses to a world no one else remembers. What this produces is not warmth exactly. It is something beyond warmth, something that has been compressed by duration into a denser substance. They complete each other's sentences not as an affectation, but because they have been having the same conversation for so long that the sentences have become genuinely shared. The thought begins in one mind, and the words emerge from whichever mouth happens to be speaking at the moment. They do not disagree in any meaningful sense. This is not because one dominates the other, or because either suppresses their own perspective, but because their perspectives have been refining themselves against each other for so long that the disagreements were ground away centuries ago, leaving a residue of shared understanding so thorough it functions as a single consciousness distributed across two separate beings. This makes them, in practical terms, impossible to divide. Chelsea's gift, which constitutes perhaps the most powerful political weapon in the Volturi's arsenal, the ability to dissolve the bonds between vampires and reshape loyalties, has never succeeded in doing anything meaningful to the connection between Vladimir and Stefan. Not because the gift does not work on them, Chelsea's gift works on everyone, but because the bond it would need to dissolve is not simply an emotional attachment of the kind that vampires typically form. It is a structural fact. It is load-bearing in a way that few relationships ever become. Removing it would not weaken them. It would unmake them into something neither of them would any longer be. Their attitude toward the Volturi is the final thing that defines them, and it is worth examining carefully because it is frequently misread as simple hatred in the way that complex things are frequently misread as simple ones. The feeling they carry toward Aro and his brothers is not simple hatred, though hatred is certainly present and has certainly been present without interruption for several thousand years. It is something more structured than hatred. It is the orientation of beings who have had millennia to think about a specific problem and have developed, across that time, a genuinely sophisticated understanding of every dimension of it. They do not underestimate the Volturi. They have never underestimated the Volturi. Not since the night they looked directly at what Jane and Alec could do in the stone halls of their fortress and made the rational decision to run rather than die pointlessly. They understand the Volturi's power with complete clarity, understand its sources and its structure, and its genuine formidability. They simply do not accept it as legitimate, have never accepted it as legitimate, and consider the pretense of legitimacy that the Volturi wrap around it to be among the most offensive of many offensive things about the current arrangement of the world. What they offer, instead of the Volturi's elaborate self-justifying ideology, is a radical honesty about what they are and what they want. They are ancient predators who were the apex of the vampire world and had that position taken from them through a combination of strategic brilliance and overwhelming force, and they want it back. They want the Volturi dismantled. They want the world reorganized around a different center. They want, in the most fundamental sense, the reversal of several thousand years of history. They know this is a large want. They have never found the size of it a reason to want anything different. This is who Vladimir and Stefan are when they receive Carlisle Cullen's invitation to travel to a small town in Washington state and witness something that might, for the first time in a very long time, be genuinely useful to them. They are ancient and ashen-eyed and darkly funny and bound to each other beyond the reach of any gift that might try to separate them. They are patient in the way that only very old, very focused, very specifically motivated things are patient. And they are, after several thousand years of waiting, beginning to think that the wait might finally be approaching something worth waiting for. The invitation arrived through channels that the Volturi did not control, which was itself already interesting. Carlisle Cullen had spent the better part of his long existence building something that was, in many ways, the philosophical opposite of everything Vladimir and Stefan represented. A coven organized around the rejection of human blood, around the deliberate cultivation of relationships with the human world rather than dominion over it, around the idea that vampire existence could be conducted with something approaching moral integrity. Vladimir and Stefan found this project bewildering in its premises and faintly amusing in its details. The notion of a vampire who worked as a physician, who lived among humans, as though the difference between predator and prey were a technicality rather than a fundamental reality, who had assembled around himself a family of like-minded abstainers as though the thirst were merely a bad habit to be managed through commitment and community support. It was the kind of thing that became funnier the longer you thought about it. But Carlisle had also assembled, whether through intention or the particular fortune that sometimes attached itself to principal projects, one of the most extraordinary collections of gifted vampires in the world, outside of Volterra itself. And this was considerably less amusing and considerably more interesting. The message that reached Vladimir and Stefan described a situation that required witnesses. A child had been born to a vampire father and a human mother, something without precedent in the documented history of their kind. The Volturi were coming under the pretext that this child was an immortal child, one of the categorically prohibited beings whose creation represented perhaps the most absolute of all their laws. The Cullens needed vampires who could observe and testify that the child was something different, something new, something that did not fit the category the Volturi were determined to apply to her. Vladimir read the message with the focused attention he brought to anything that mentioned the Volturi moving against anyone. Stefan read it beside him, and the silence between them as they finished was the specific quality of silence that meant they were both thinking the same thing, and neither needed to say it yet. They would go. Of course they would go. The only question was whether to appear eager, which would reveal the depth of their interest, or to appear reluctant, which would be a performance neither of them had much patience for after several thousand years of having earned the right to want what they wanted openly. They settled, characteristically, on honesty. They accepted, promptly. The journey west and north took them across landscapes that changed character as they moved, from the ancient Eastern European territories that carried the faint residue of their own long history, through the western regions that had developed entirely within the Volturi's era, and finally to the Pacific Northwest of North America, a part of the world that had not existed within any framework of vampire power during the Romanian Empire, because no vampire of that era had yet reached it. This geography was entirely the Volturi's world, unmarked by anything that had preceded them. Vladimir and Stefan moved through it with a particular quality of attention that they brought to all Volturi era territory, noting it, cataloguing it, existing within it, without for a single moment accepting it as legitimate. Forks, Washington was a small, rain-saturated town that seemed an unlikely setting for anything of consequence. But the Cullens' house, when they arrived, was already accumulating something that immediately shifted Vladimir and Stefan's assessment of the situation from interesting to genuinely significant. Vampires were gathering from across the world, not in the organized manner of a Volturi summons, not with the specific fearful compliance that attended those gatherings, but with the varied and individual responses of beings who had been contacted personally by a vampire they respected and had made their own decisions about whether to come. The Amazon Coven, the Irish Coven, nomads from multiple continents, the Egyptian Coven's representative presence, complicated by Amun's obvious reluctance and equally obvious fear. Vampires who had no prior relationship with each other, no shared history, no organizational framework connecting them. Brought together by a single unusual circumstance into a proximity they would otherwise never have occupied. Vladimir and Stefan moved through this gathering with the unhurried attention of the oldest beings present, which they were by a margin so vast it would have been difficult to fully convey to most of those assembled. They were older than the Volturi themselves. They were older than any organizational structure currently existing in the vampire world. They were older than the laws being invoked to justify the approaching confrontation. Older than the authority claiming the right to enforce those laws. Older than essentially every framework within which every other vampire present was accustomed to understanding their existence. This age was felt even by vampires who did not know their history. Something registered in the presence of Vladimir and Stefan that registered differently than simple power or simple threat. Something that produced in other vampires a response closer to the sensation of standing near a geological formation than the sensation of encountering another person. They were the landscape as much as they were individuals within it. The child was presented to them as she was presented to all the witnesses, and they studied her with a focused, unsentimentally curious attention they brought to anything genuinely new Renesmee Cullen was, whatever else she was, genuinely new. Half human, half vampire, growing at a rate that had no precedent, possessed of a gift for direct mental communication that functioned differently from any telepathic ability previously documented. She was warm where vampires were cold. She had a heartbeat where they had silence. She carried in her biological reality the intersection of two categories that the vampire world had always maintained as absolute and separate. She was interesting in the way that only genuinely unprecedented things were interesting, not because her specific personal qualities were remarkable, though they may have been, but because her existence represented a disruption in the established order of things. And disruptions in the established order of things were the only category of development that had ever offered Vladimir and Stefan anything worth paying attention to. They did not perform warmth toward her or toward the Cullens who gathered around her with such obvious protective devotion. They were not there to perform warmth. The Cullens understood this with the clarity that Carlyle's intelligence and the general perceptiveness of his assembled family made possible. Vladimir and Stefan's presence was useful and welcome in the specific sense that a very sharp tool is useful and welcome when you need something cut, regardless of the fact that the tool has no particular investment in your well-being. The days before the Volturi's arrival were spent in the accumulation of observation. Vladimir and Stefan watched the assembled witnesses with the same systematic attention they had brought to every gathering of consequence across the centuries, cataloguing gifts and personalities and relationships and the specific quality of each vampire's commitment to the situation they found themselves in. Some were genuinely invested in the Cullen's survival. Some were there out of obligation to relationships they valued. Some were curious about the child. Some were frightened and present anyway, which was in some ways the most interesting category because it spoke to the depth of their respect for Carlyle. And underneath all of this, Vladimir and Stefan were assessing something else. The tactical reality of what was assembled in that field in Washington, measured against the tactical reality of what was approaching from Italy. They had been thinking about how to fight the Volturi for several thousand years. They had never previously had access to anything approaching the resources gathered in that clearing. The gap between the two realities, what they had spent millennia wishing for and what was currently standing in a Pacific Northwest forest, was narrower than it had ever been in their long exile. Uncomfortably, tantalizingly, provocatively narrower. The Volturi arrived with the full apparatus of their authority. The guard assembled, the witnesses they had brought for their own purposes trailing behind, the whole theatrical machinery of their governance deployed in the service of what Vladimir and Stefan could identify from considerable distance as a predetermined conclusion being dressed in the language of procedure. Aro intended to destroy the Cullens. The immortal child pretext was exactly that. A pretext, a legally formatted justification for an action whose real motivation was the elimination of a coven that had accumulated too many gifts and too much independent standing to be comfortable. Vladimir and Stefan recognized this immediately, and with the specific recognition of beings who had watched Aro operate for several thousand years. The performance of deliberation, the elaborate staging of a decision-making process that had already concluded before it began. They had seen this before. They had, in a sense, experienced its most extreme application personally. Standing in that field and watching Aro perform his careful, theatrical consideration of the assembled evidence, Vladimir felt something that he had not felt in a very long time move through him. Not hope exactly, something more focused and more specific than hope. The sense of a door that had been sealed for millennia developing finally, the faint but unmistakable outline of a crack. The confrontation played out across an extended, tension-saturated standoff in which the possibility of violence remained present throughout, charged and immediate, never quite resolving in either direction. The Volturi's gifted guard faced the assembled witnesses across a field that had become, through the specific alchemy of the situation, something close to an even match, which was itself an extraordinary statement about how far the Volturi's monopoly on overwhelming force had eroded in this particular moment. Vladimir and Stefan stood within this standoff and experienced it with all the complicated feeling of beings for whom every moment of Volturi discomfort was simultaneously satisfying and insufficient. Satisfying because watching the ancient enemy face genuine resistance for the first time in millennia was a pleasure that transcended even their capacity for detachment. Insufficient because satisfaction was not what they had come for. They had come for consequence, for the kind of rupture that could not be repaired and would not be recovered from. For the moment when Aro's careful centuries of constructed authority finally cracked beyond the possibility of maintenance. Then Alice arrived. She came with proof, a half-vampire male, adult and fully functional, existing as evidence that the category of being Renesmee represented was not unique, was not unprecedented, was not the existential threat the Volturi had characterized it as. The pretext collapsed. Whatever legal architecture Aro had been constructing around his predetermined conclusion lost its foundation in a single moment of presented evidence, and the field in Washington became the site of something Vladimir and Stefan had genuinely not expected to witness in their lifetimes. The Volturi retreating, not fleeing, not being defeated in the way that would have satisfied the thousands of years of waiting that had brought Vladimir and Stefan to that field, but withdrawing, recalculating, folding the elaborate performance of their authority back around themselves, and departing with the specific careful dignity of beings who had decided that today was not the day, and that a tactical withdrawal was preferable to an engagement whose outcome had become genuinely uncertain. Vladimir watched them go with an expression that anyone observing carefully would have recognized as the particular face of a very old, very patient thing that had just received information it would spend a long time processing. The witnesses dispersed. The Cullens gathered around their child and each other with the specific relief of beings who were prepared for death and received life instead. The extraordinary gathering that had assembled from across the world began its dissolution back into the separate existences from which it had temporarily been drawn. Vladimir and Stefan remained standing in the field a moment longer than necessary. As the clearing emptied around them, two ancient figures in the grey Washington light, the Volturi, had come to destroy, and had left without destroying. The confrontation that should by every precedent have ended in Cullen deaths had instead ended in Volturi withdrawal. The aura of absolute, inevitable, uncontestable authority that had sustained the Volturi power across millennia had developed in front of several dozen witnesses from across the vampire world, a visible and unmistakable crack. It was not victory. Vladimir and Stefan understood with complete clarity that it was not victory, and neither of them made the mistake of experiencing it as such. The Volturi were intact, their guard was intact, their power base in Volterra was intact. Everything that made them dangerous was exactly as dangerous as it had been the morning this confrontation began. But something had changed. Something small and specific and, to the right kind of attention, enormously significant. The vampire world had just watched the Volturi hesitate, and Vladimir and Stefan, who had been waiting for the right kind of something for several thousand years, turned away from the emptying field and began the process of deciding what to do with it. There is a version of Vladimir and Stefan's presence in Forks that reads as opportunistic. Two ancient vampires who received an invitation travelled across the world to see what might be gained and found themselves in a situation whose potential they recognized and attempted to exploit. This version is not wrong. It is simply incomplete in the way that all surfaces are incomplete descriptions of the depths beneath them. The fuller version requires understanding something about how Vladimir and Stefan think, which in turn requires understanding how several thousand years of singular focus shapes a mind. They did not arrive in Forks as observers who became participants. They arrived as strategists who had been running the same calculation for millennia, who had spent those millennia developing an increasingly sophisticated understanding of every variable in that calculation, and who recognized in the gathering of witnesses something that their long analysis had always identified as a necessary precondition for anything that might eventually matter: a crack in the consensus. The Volturi's power had always rested on two foundations. The first was the guard, the assembled gifts, the physical and supernatural capability that made direct confrontation suicidal. The second was more intangible and in some ways more important: the universal acceptance among vampires that the Volturi's authority was simply the nature of things, that resistance was not merely dangerous, but categorically pointless, that the question of whether their governance was legitimate had been settled so long ago that raising it again was not even a coherent position to occupy. This second foundation was what made the first one so effective. An enemy who believes they cannot win will not fight even when fighting might have succeeded. Vladimir and Stefan had spent thousands of years as the only vampires in the world who genuinely did not share this acceptance, who remembered a world organized differently and held that memory as evidence that the current arrangement was contingent rather than inevitable. They had been, for most of those thousands of years, alone in this position. Two voices in a vampire world where every other voice had been shaped entirely within the Volturi's era, had no framework for imagining authority organized otherwise, and had every practical incentive to accept the current order as natural. Forks had changed the composition of the room, and Vladimir and Stefan intended to make full use of that change. Their movement through the assembled witnesses during the days before the Volturi's arrival was not casual. It looked casual. They possessed the particular gift of beings who have had millennia to learn how to appear to be doing one thing while doing another. But it was purposeful and systematic and informed by a detailed assessment of every vampire present. They knew, through observation and through the particular intelligence that accumulated age provided, which witnesses were present out of genuine loyalty to Carlyle, which were there out of curiosity, which had been persuaded into attendance by relationships they valued and would have preferred not to strain, and which, the category they were most interested in, harboured some existing resentment toward Volturi authority that had simply never had a context in which to express itself. This last category was smaller than Vladimir would have liked, but larger than he had expected. The Volturi's governance, however comprehensively it had restructured the vampire world around its own perpetuation, had not managed to eliminate the basic experience of being governed by something that prioritized its own interests over those of the governed. Vampires who had lost coven members to Volturi enforcement. Vampires who had been required to abandon established territories at Volturi insistence. Vampires who had watched the guard arrive and deliver consequences for violations that seemed disproportionate to the offense. These experiences existed in the community, quiet and unvoiced, because voicing them was dangerous. But they existed. Vladimir and Stefan spoke to these vampires with the particular credibility of the only beings in the room who had both the historical standing to characterize the Volturi's governance honestly and the personal experience of what it meant to be on the receiving end of their full attention. They did not advocate openly. They did not position themselves as organizers of resistance or leaders of opposition. That would have been premature and would have triggered the Volturi's attention in ways that were not yet useful. What they did was subtler and, in the long run, more effective. They named things. They provided language and historical context for experiences that other vampires had been carrying without a framework to hold them in. The sense that the Volturi's laws served Volturi interests more comprehensively than they served vampire interests generally. Vladimir could articulate this with a precision and a credibility that no other voice in that gathering could match, because he had watched those laws being constructed from the outside, had seen their architecture clearly, had spent thousands of years observing how they operated in practice. The sense that the current confrontation was not really about an immortal child at all, but about the Volturi's discomfort with any coven that accumulated enough independent power to exist outside their complete control. Stefan could describe this pattern with the specificity of someone who had watched it repeat across centuries, who could name previous instances, who had the historical perspective that everyone else in that gathering lacked. This was the most sophisticated thing they did in Forks, and it operated on a timescale that extended well beyond the immediate confrontation. They were not only trying to influence the behavior of specific witnesses in the next few days. They were seeding something, planting a particular way of understanding the Volturi, not as natural authority, but as constructed power, not as inevitable governance, but as one historical arrangement among others that had existed and could therefore cease to exist. Into the minds of vampires who would carry those seeds back to their own covens and their own territories when the gathering dispersed. Within the immediate situation, their tactical preferences were clear and consistently expressed. They wanted a fight. They made no particular effort to conceal this, because concealing it would have required them to pretend to a commitment to peaceful resolution that they did not have, and that everyone paying attention already understood they did not have. What they did instead was frame their preference in terms that appealed to something broader than their personal interest in Volturi destruction. The argument they made is various forms and to various audiences across those tense preparatory days, was fundamentally about precedent. If the Volturi were permitted to arrive with a predetermined conclusion, conduct a performance of deliberation, and execute that conclusion regardless of the evidence presented, which was precisely what Aro intended, then the gathering of witnesses had been meaningless. The assembled gifts, the extraordinary collection of capability that Carlyle had managed to bring together, the unprecedented concentration of vampire power in that field, all of it would have been demonstrated to be insufficient to protect even a coven of this strength against Volturi decision. And every vampire in the world would absorb that lesson. But if the assembled force was used, if the witnesses became something more than observers, if the situation became a genuine test of whether the Volturi's authority could be contested by a sufficiently organized opposition, then a different lesson was available, one that Vladimir and Stefan had been waiting several thousand years for the world to learn. The Cullens resisted this framing with a consistency that Vladimir found genuinely frustrating. Carlyle's commitment to avoiding unnecessary violence was not a performance or a political position. It was a genuine and deeply held value that had structured his entire existence and that the members of his family shared with varying degrees of personal conviction. They were not going to be argued into an offensive posture. They were going to stand in that field and present their evidence and trust that the truth would be sufficient, which was a strategy that Vladimir considered touching in the way that things are touching when they reflect a kind of faith you genuinely cannot share. What the Cullens had that Vladimir wanted, specifically and concretely, was Bella's gift. A shield that could render Jane and Alec functionally useless was not merely a defensive asset in the context of the immediate confrontation. It was the single most strategically significant development in the long problem of how to fight the Volturi that Vladimir had encountered in several thousand years of considering that problem. Jane and Alec were the Volturi's most decisive offensive weapons, the gifts around which their military capacity was organized, the abilities that made direct confrontation feel impossible to anyone who had seen them operate. A shield that neutralized both simultaneously changed the calculation in ways that Vladimir had been turning over in his mind since the moment he understood what Bella could do. He watched her maintain it across the full width of the assembled witnesses during the confrontation with an attention that was not admiration exactly. Vladimir did not tend toward admiration, but was the focused, almost reverential attention of someone watching something they have wanted to exist for a very long time, finally existing. The arrival of Alice with Hoylan and Nahuel was the moment when Vladimir understood that the immediate confrontation would not become the battle he had positioned himself to participate in. The evidence was conclusive. Aro's pretext was destroyed in a specific and public way that made proceeding with his original intention politically costly in front of the assembled witnesses. The elaborate performance of Volturi deliberation had produced a result that Aro had not scripted, and the response to this result, the recalibration, the tactical retreat dressed in the language of merciful restraint, was visible to everyone present for exactly what it was. Vladimir watched the Volturi withdraw and felt the specific quality of disappointment that belonged to someone who had prepared for one outcome and received a lesser one. Not the catastrophic disappointment of defeat, the precise, focused disappointment of someone who could see the larger game clearly and understood that this particular move had ended without the decisive consequence it had briefly appeared to promise. He and Stefan exchanged the look that required no words, that communicated in the compressed language of millennia, of shared understanding everything that needed to be communicated. They had not won anything today, but they had watched the Volturi retreat in front of witnesses from across the vampire world, and those witnesses were about to return to their own territories, carrying something in their minds that had not been there before they arrived. The question of what to do with that was not a question Vladimir and Stefan needed to answer immediately. They had time. They had, as they had demonstrated comprehensively, essentially unlimited time and the specific quality of patience that came with it. They would think carefully, as they always thought carefully, about what the situation now contained that it had not contained before, and what the situation that contained those new elements made possible that had not been possible before. They left Forks without ceremony, without the warm farewells that the dispersing witnesses exchanged with the Cullens and with each other. They had not come for warmth, and they did not leave with any. What they left with was more durable and more useful than warmth. They left with a comprehensive catalogue of everything that had been assembled, demonstrated, and revealed in that field over the course of a confrontation that the Volturi had arrived intending to control absolutely and had departed having controlled only partially. Partial control for the Volturi was a new experience. Vladimir intended to understand it completely. What Vladimir and Stefan carry out of Forks is not a plan exactly. It is something more preliminary and in some ways more valuable than a plan. It is a revised understanding of the possible, a recalibrated map of the territory between where they currently are and where they have always intended to arrive. Plans can be disrupted. Possibilities, once genuinely established, cannot be unmade. The Volturi retreated in front of witnesses. That happened. It is now a permanent feature of the landscape, and Vladimir and Stefan, who have spent thousands of years in the business of understanding what features of a landscape can be used and how, will not stop thinking about it until they have extracted every implication it contains. What follows is not established history. It is projection. Informed, careful, grounded in everything canon has shown us about who these two beings are and how they think and what they want. But it is projection of the specific kind that becomes almost inevitable when you understand the character well enough. Some futures are not guaranteed by events, but they are made nearly irresistible by personality. Vladimir and Stefan are nothing if not consistent. They have been consistent across several thousand years. The shape of what they will do next is visible in the shape of everything they have already done. The first and most immediate consequence of what happened in Forks is the one that Vladimir and Stefan will have begun processing before they reach the edge of that clearing. The Volturi's greatest strategic asset has never been the guard, though the guard is formidable. It has been the perception of the guard as insurmountable, the conviction installed across centuries of careful demonstration and reinforced by every example made and every coven destroyed, that the question of whether Volturi authority could be successfully challenged was not an open question. It was settled. It had been settled before most living vampires were transformed, and the settled quality of it had done more work than any gift Jane or Alec possessed, because it meant the question was not seriously asked. It has now been seriously asked. In front of witnesses from across the vampire world, the Volturi arrived to exercise absolute authority and departed having exercised something considerably less than that. The witnesses saw it. They will return to their own covens and their own territories carrying the memory of it. And the memory of it will do something to the settled conviction. Not dissolve it, not transform it overnight into widespread readiness to resist, but introduce into it a quality of uncertainty that was not previously there. A hairline fracture in the consensus, nearly invisible, genuinely significant. Vladimir's first theory of the next phase is about that fracture and how it might be widened, not quickly, not through any overt campaign or organized movement that would draw Volturi attention before the conditions were right, but through the patient, sustained work of ensuring that the memory of what happened in Forks does not simply fade, as memories tend to fade when they are inconvenient to the powerful. The Volturi will work to manage the narrative of that confrontation. They will characterize their withdrawal as merciful restraint, as the gracious recognition of evidence by an authority secure enough in its legitimacy to respond to truth rather than simply impose predetermined conclusions. This characterization will be delivered through the various channels of influence the Volturi have spent centuries developing, and it will be effective with vampires who want to believe it, who find the cognitive comfort of the existing order preferable to the discomfort of genuinely questioning it. Vladimir and Stefan will tell a different story, not loudly, not in any form that constitutes the kind of open defiance that would give the Volturi legal justification to act against them, but in the conversations they will have one at a time with vampires they assess as receptive. The Volturi hesitated because they were genuinely uncertain of the outcome, not because they were being merciful, because they looked at what was assembled in that field and could not guarantee the result they needed. This is what restraint looked like when it was actually fear wearing restraint's clothing. The difference matters. The difference is everything. Over time, and Vladimir and Stefan have demonstrated comprehensively that they are capable of working over very long periods of time. This counter-narrative, delivered with the credibility of the only beings alive who have both the standing and the historical perspective to deliver it, will reach a sufficient number of minds to constitute a genuine shift in the ambient understanding of what the Volturi are and what they can be made to face. The second thread concerns the witness network itself, which Vladimir and Stefan will recognize as the most practically significant infrastructure created by the Forks confrontation and the one most worth preserving. Carlyle built those connections out of desperation and personal relationship. He reached out to every coven he had ever known and asked for help, and many of them came. And in coming, they created relationships with each other that had not previously existed. The Amazon Coven and the Irish Coven had no prior connection. The various nomads had never shared a context before that field. The Egyptian Coven's presence, however reluctant, represented a relationship between Amun and the Cullens that had been tested under genuine pressure and had, in however complicated a form, held. These connections will not maintain themselves automatically. Carlyle may make some effort to preserve them, but Carlyle's purposes are fundamentally domestic. He wants his family safe and wants to be left alone to live the life they have chosen. And sustained political organizing is not the project he has devoted his existence to. The network will tend to disperse back into the separate existences from which it was temporarily drawn, unless something works actively to maintain it. Vladimir and Stefan will work actively to maintain it, not as Carlyle's allies or as participants in any project the Cullens would recognize as consistent with their values, but as independent operators who understand that a pre-existing network of relationships between covens that have demonstrated willingness to act collectively, however reluctantly, is an asset too significant to allow to simply dissolve. They will maintain contact with specific witnesses whose resentment toward Volturi authority they assessed as genuine and potentially durable. They will make themselves available as resources, repositories of historical knowledge, sources of context, the senior figures in an informal understanding that the current arrangement of the vampire world is neither inevitable nor permanent. This is, in structure, the beginning of something that could eventually become what the Romanian Empire was in its original form. A network of relationships organized around a central authority, except that Vladimir and Stefan are too intelligent to attempt to position themselves explicitly as that authority before the conditions exist to support it. They will build the network first. The authority can follow when the network is ready to hold it. The third and most speculative thread concerns Renesmee, and it is worth considering carefully because it represents a category of interest that is genuinely novel in Vladimir and Stefan's long history of strategic thinking. They have never previously encountered a being whose existence disrupted established categories in quite the way that Renesmee's does, half human, half vampire, growing toward an adulthood whose parameters are unknown, possessed of a gift for direct experiential communication that functions differently from any telepathic ability previously catalogued. She is, in the most literal sense, unprecedented. Unprecedented things are Vladimir and Stefan's preferred category of development, because unprecedented things have not yet been incorporated into the Volturi's frameworks for maintaining control. The laws were written around known categories of being. The enforcement mechanisms were designed for known threats. Something genuinely new exists, at least initially, in a space that the existing architecture of control has not yet been calibrated for. And that space is interesting. What Renesmee will become as she reaches full maturity is unknown to everyone, including presumably herself. Her gifts may develop further. Her unique biology may produce capabilities that no one has anticipated. Her relationship with the Quileute wolves, a connection that represents its own category of unprecedented development, given that vampires and shapeshifters have maintained mutual hostility as their default relationship since before living memory, may evolve into something whose implications extend beyond the immediate community of Forks. Vladimir and Stefan will be watching all of this with the patient attention of beings who understand that the genuinely unprecedented is worth monitoring across whatever timescale its development requires. The fourth thread is the most direct and the most dangerous, which means it is also the one that requires the most patience before it can be acted upon. It concerns Bella's shield. What Bella Cullen can do, extend a protective barrier that renders Jane and Alec functionally useless across a significant physical area, is, in purely military terms, the single development most relevant to the specific problem. of how to fight the Volturi that has emerged in several thousand years. Vladimir and Stefan have had longer to think about this problem than anyone else alive, and the conclusion they have consistently reached is that any direct challenge to the Volturi requires an answer to Jane and Alec. Without such an answer, the guard's offensive capability is essentially decisive, and all the collected gifts and assembled numbers in the world become irrelevant when Jane's attention settles on a target or Alec's gift rolls outward like a fog. Bella's shield is that answer. Hittichim was demonstrated in that field to work exactly as thoroughly as it needed to work, maintaining its integrity under the full pressure of a Volturi confrontation, extending across the full width of the assembled witnesses, holding without apparent effort or degradation. Vladimir watched it perform and understood with complete clarity that what he was watching was the specific capability that had been missing from the calculation for millennia. The Cullens will not use this capability in the service of the goals Vladimir and Stefan have spent their existence pursuing. This is as near to certain as anything can be in a future that has not yet unfolded. Carlyle did not build what he has built. The family, the relationships, the careful decades of peaceful coexistence, in order to become the military vanguard of a Romanian restoration. The values that make the Cullen Coven what it is are precisely the values that make them unsuitable partners for what Vladimir actually wants, but suited partners are not the only kind of useful ones. The Volturi's history is full of situations in which parties with incompatible ultimate goals found temporary and productive alignment around specific shared interests. The Volturi themselves had spent centuries cultivating exactly this kind of relationship with covens, whose values they held in complete contempt, but whose capabilities they found temporarily convenient. Vladimir and Stefan can learn from what they have spent thousands of years observing. They will not pursue a genuine alliance with the Cullens. They will pursue a relationship of strategic proximity, remaining close enough to the most gifted independent coven in the world that when the Volturi inevitably turn their attention back toward Forks, as Vladimir is certain they eventually will, the confrontation that follows produces an outcome that the Cullens' values and the Romanians' patience together make possible. The fifth thread is the longest, and in some ways the most fundamental, and it concerns the question of whether Vladimir and Stefan have already been doing some of this for longer than anyone realizes. The assumption most vampires make about them, when they think about them at all, which is not often, is that they are reactive, that they wonder and resent and occasionally involve themselves in situations that seem promising, and are then disappointed when those situations fail to produce the rupture they are waiting for. That their strategy, such as it is, consists primarily of readiness rather than active construction. This assumption may not be accurate. Vladimir and Stefan have had thousands of years to develop networks, to cultivate relationships with vampires whose resentment toward Volturi authority makes them potentially useful, to position themselves within the informal information flows of the vampire world in ways that ensure they learn about developments, like the one in Forks, in sufficient time to involve themselves meaningfully. The speed with which they accepted Carlyle's invitation, the readiness of their travel and their arrival, the sophistication with which they immediately assessed and began working the dynamics of the assembled witnesses. None of this is the behavior of beings who are improvising their response to an unexpected opportunity. It is the behavior of beings who have been maintaining the infrastructure for exactly this kind of involvement across a very long period of time, waiting for the right situation to make use of it. If this reading is correct, and it is consistent with everything canon has shown us about the quality of their intelligence and the depth of their patience, then what happened in Forks was not the beginning of something for Vladimir and Stefan. It was a visible portion of something whose invisible portions have been developing for far longer than anyone has noticed. The gathering of witnesses, the confrontation, the withdrawal of the Volturi, the dispersal of the network back across the world. All of it was a step in a progression that began long before Carlyle's message arrived and will continue long after. The memory of that specific field on that specific day has faded from the minds of everyone who was present except two. What Vladimir and Stefan will do next is not separable from what they have always been doing, which is the patient, meticulous, 1,000-year construction of the conditions under which the Volturi's supremacy can finally, permanently, and completely be ended. They have been building toward this across a timescale that makes the Volturi's own centuries of patient preparation look brief by comparison. They are not finished. They have never been finished. The exile that the Volturi imposed on them when they took the fortress and destroyed the court and let two survivors walk away into the forest was not, as the Volturi may have calculated, a sufficient ending. It was an interruption, a very long one, across a span of time that would be incomprehensible to any human mind, and genuinely impressive even by vampire standards. But an interruption in a project that has never stopped, that has been continuing at whatever pace the available conditions permitted, that has been absorbing every piece of relevant information and every new development and every shift in the landscape of vampire power into an analysis that never stops running. The Romanian Coven is two vampires in a world that has moved on without them and built its current order over the ruins of what they constructed. They have no territory, no court, no formal authority, no official standing within any structure that currently governs the vampire world. By every conventional measure of power, as it is currently organized, they are marginal. But they are also the most patient things in the world. They are the most specifically motivated things in the world. They are the oldest things in the world, with the longest perspective and the most comprehensive understanding of how the current order was built, and therefore how it might be unmade. And they have just watched, for the first time in thousands of years, the Volturi flinch. Whatever comes next will be built on that. Vladimir and Stefan will make certain of it. They have, after all, nothing but time, nothing but focus, and nothing but the absolute crystalline certainty of beings who have been waiting long enough to have become, in their waiting, something almost indistinguishable from inevitable. And so, my dreamy travelers, we arrive at the end of the oldest story in the vampire world, or perhaps not the end, perhaps only the place where the visible portion of the story gives way to the portion still being written in the cold and patient dark. What Vladimir and Stefan represent in the larger world of Twilight is something that no other characters quite manage to represent. They are the memory of the vampire world made flesh, the living proof that the current order is not the natural order, that what presents itself as inevitable is only the most recent arrangement of forces that have been shifting since before almost anything alive today existed. They are the before, still present in an after that has done everything in its power to make the before seem like it never was. There is something in that worth sitting with as sleep comes to find you. The idea that the oldest things are not always the most powerful things, but they are very often the most patient. That empires fall, and the hatred born in their falling does not diminish with the centuries, but only deepens, clarifies, finds the particular cold and permanent shape it will keep forever. That two beings stripped of everything except each other, and the absolute clarity of what they want, can persist across a span of time that makes the rest of history feel like an afternoon. Vladimir and Stefan are still out there, somewhere in the ancient landscapes of their long exile in the cold forests and the mountain dark where their story began. Still carrying the perfect memory of stone halls that no longer stand. Still watching Volturi with the focused attention of beings who have never looked away. Still patient, still certain, still waiting for the moment that millennia of waiting have been building toward. The fortress in the Carpathians is ruins now, cold stones settling into the earth that held it, the torchlight gone. The court dissolved into history that most have forgotten, but the two who built it have not forgotten. They never forget anything. That is both their burden and, in the end, their most enduring weapon. So let the ancient dark settle around you now, my dreamy travelers. Let the weight of all those centuries rest gently at the edges of your awareness. Let the story of the oldest empire and the longest hatred drift with you into whatever dreams are waiting. The cold Carpathian night is very still. The forests are very deep. And somewhere, within them, two ancient figures stand exactly as they have always stood. Watching, waiting, remembering everything. Rest now. The story will still be there when you wake. These things always are. Good night.